When Willa Bennett's tearful face caught the first rays of dawn, there was nothing left for her in the place she had once called home. The year was 1873, and propriety ruled with an iron fist in the small town of Cedar Creek, Colorado Territory. At 22, unmarried and with a noticeable swell beneath her calico dress, she had committed the unforgivable sin in her mother's eyes. "You bring nothing but shame to this family," Margaret Bennett had hissed the night before, her voice cutting through the dim light of their modest parlor. "Your father, God rest his soul, would turn in his grave if he knew what you've done." Willa had stood silent, one hand protectively covering her 5-month belly. "Mother, please, no. I've decided. You will not remain under this roof another day. I cannot bear the whispers, the stares from decent folk. Tomorrow you leave." The tears had come then, streaming down Willa's cheeks. "Where will I go?" Her mother's face had remained stone. "That is no longer my concern." Now, in the golden light of morning, Willa clutched a small cloth bundle containing the few possessions her mother had allowed her to take. A change of clothes, her father's pocket watch, and the small amount of money she had saved from selling eggs at the market. $23.18, all that stood between her and destitution. The stagecoach wasn't due until noon, and Willa couldn't bear to remain in town where prying eyes would follow her every move. She decided to walk the mile to the station and wait there, away from the gossip that had already begun to spread like wildfire. The road stretched before her, dusty and rutted from recent wagon wheels. May had brought warmth to the Colorado air, but the morning still held a chill that made Willa pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Each step took her farther from everything familiar, toward an uncertain future that terrified her more with every passing moment. By the time she reached the small wooden structure that served as the stagecoach station, her feet ached and her back throbbed with pain. The building sat alone on the plains, with only a water trough and hitching post to keep it company. No one was about. The station wouldn't open for hours yet. Willa lowered herself carefully onto the bench outside, setting her bundle beside her. Where would she go? Denver was the logical choice, a larger city where she might find work and anonymity. But who would hire an obviously pregnant, unmarried woman? And what would become of her child? The baby kicked, a gentle flutter that brought fresh tears to her eyes. Despite everything, she couldn't regret this life growing within her. James Whitaker had promised her marriage, had sworn his undying love in heated whispers behind her father's barn. Then he'd left on a cattle drive to Kansas City and never returned. Word eventually reached Cedar Creek that he'd taken up with a saloon girl in Dodge City. The distant sound of hoofbeats pulled Willa from her thoughts. A rider was approaching from the west, not the direction of town. She straightened, wiping hastily at her tear-stained cheeks. The last thing she needed was to appear more pathetic than she already was. The horse and rider materialized from the shimmering heat on the horizon, gradually taking form. A tall man on a chestnut gelding, moving at an unhurried pace. As he drew closer, Willa could make out a wide-brimmed hat shading his face and the dusty clothes of a working cowboy. The rider slowed as he approached the station, clearly surprised to find someone waiting there so early. He tipped his hat politely as he dismounted, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, with striking blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her situation at a glance. "Madam," he greeted, his voice deep and gentle. "You're at the station mighty early." Willa nodded, unsure whether to engage or remain silent. Propriety dictated that a young woman shouldn't speak casually with strange men, but propriety had already abandoned her. "The noon stage," she said simply. "I thought it best to wait here." The man tied his horse to the hitching post and approached, keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Daniel Reed. Most folks call me Dane." "Willa Bennett," she replied, then immediately regretted giving her real name. What if word got back to town? Dane noticed her discomfort and the small bundle beside her. His gaze flickered briefly to her midsection before returning to her face with no change in his expression. "Mind if I wait with you? Station won't open for hours yet, and it's not right for a lady to sit alone out here." Before Willa could answer, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and double over. Immediately, Dane was at her side, his strong hand supporting her elbow. "Miss Bennett? Are you all right?" Willa clutched her belly, fear coursing through her. It was too early. The baby wasn't due for months yet. I don't know," she managed, her voice tight with pain. Another contraction seized her, and she cried out. Dane's expression turned grave. "You need help and quick. The doc in town." "No!" Willa grabbed his arm. "I can't go back to town. They've cast me out." Understanding dawned in Dane's eyes. He glanced around, making a quick decision. "My place is about 3 miles from here. Not much, but it's clean, and my mother was a midwife. I know a little about these things." Willa hesitated. Go with a strange man to his home? But what choice did she have? The baby was coming, months too early, and she had nowhere else to turn. "Please," she whispered. Without another word, Dane gathered her bundle and helped her to her feet. With surprising gentleness for such a large man, he lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist. "Hold on, Miss Bennett," he murmured close to her ear. "We'll get you somewhere safe." The ride was agony. Each hoofbeat sent jolts of pain through Willa's body. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood. Dane kept the horse at a steady pace, fast enough to make progress but smooth enough to minimize her discomfort. "Almost there," he said after what seemed like hours. "Just over that rise." Willa forced her eyes open to see a small cabin nestled against a stand of pines. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a corral stood nearby with several horses grazing peacefully. It wasn't much, as he'd said, but to Willa's desperate eyes, it looked like salvation. Dane helped her down from the horse and practically carried her to the cabin door. Inside was simple but neat: a table and chairs, a cook stove, shelves with provisions, and a narrow bed in one corner. "Here," he said, leading her to the bed. "Rest easy." Another contraction hit, stronger than before. Willa couldn't hold back her cry of pain. "How far along are you?" Dane asked, his voice calm as he helped her lie down. 5 months, Willa gasped. "It's too early." Dane's expression tightened, but he nodded. "I've seen calves come early and survive. Babies are stronger than they look." He moved with quiet efficiency, gathering clean cloths, heating water on the stove, laying out what supplies he had. Willa watched through a haze of pain, wondering at the stranger who was showing her more kindness than her own mother had. The next hours passed in a blur of agony. Dane stayed by her side, offering water, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, speaking words of encouragement. When the final pains came, he coached her through them with steady words. "That's it, Willa. Push now. You're doing fine." With a final, desperate effort, Willa felt the baby slide from her body. The cabin filled with silence, no cry, no sound at all. Terror clutched at her heart. "Dane," she whispered. He was bent over the tiny form, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy. "She's breathing," he said after a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. "But she's so small." A girl. Willa had a daughter. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by fear. "Let me see her." Dane wrapped the infant in a soft cloth and placed her gently in Willa's arms. The baby was tiny, impossibly so, with translucent skin and a wisp of dark hair. Her eyes were closed, her breathing rapid and shallow. "She's beautiful," Willa whispered, tears streaming down her face. But will she live? Dane sat on the edge of the bed, his face serious but not without hope. I can't promise that, Willa, but I can promise I'll do everything I can to help you both. The baby's eyes fluttered open then, revealing dark blue depths that seemed to look straight into Willa's soul. A tiny hand escaped the blanket, fingers curling reflexively around Willa's thumb. "Hello, little one," Willa murmured. "I'm your mama. What will you call her?" Dane asked softly. Willa looked down at the miraculous, fragile life in her arms. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." As if in response, the baby made a small sound, not quite a cry, but a definite assertion of her presence in the world. Dane smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Well, Miss Hope," he said, "you're certainly living up to your name already." The next days were a delicate balance between life and death. Hope was too small to nurse properly, so Dane showed Willa how to express milk and feed the baby with a dropper, a technique he'd used with orphan lambs. They took turns keeping watch through the nights, making sure Hope's breathing didn't falter. On the third day, when Hope seemed to be holding her own, Dane disappeared for several hours. He returned with supplies from town soft flannel for baby clothes, a proper feeding bottle with a rubber nipple, medicine from the doctor. "How did you get these?" Willa asked, surprised. Dane shrugged. "Told Doc Wilson I had a neighbor with a premature baby. He gave me what was needed, no questions asked. And the other things? The general store doesn't need to know who I'm buying for." He paused, then added, "I also brought something else." From behind his back, he produced a small wooden cradle, lovingly crafted with a curved bottom that would rock gently. "You made this?" Willa asked, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Started it last night, finished it this morning before I left for town. Every baby needs a proper place to sleep." Tears filled Willa's eyes again. She seemed to cry so easily these days. "Dane, I don't know how to thank you." He looked embarrassed. "No need for thanks. Any decent man would do the same." But Willa knew that wasn't true. Many decent men in town had turned their backs on her the moment her condition became known. This stranger had taken her in, helped deliver her child, and now was providing for them both without asking anything in return. As days turned into weeks, Hope grew stronger. Her cheeks filled out and her cry became more robust. Willa regained her strength as well, helping with chores around the cabin and learning to cook the way Dane liked hearty meals that stuck to the ribs, as he put it. They fell into an easy routine. Dane would rise before dawn to tend to his small herd of cattle and the horses he bred and trained for extra income. Willa would care for Hope and prepare breakfast. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the baby sleeping peacefully in her cradle while they talked. Dane spoke of his life, how he'd come west from Pennsylvania after the war, worked cattle drives until he'd saved enough to buy this small spread, how he dreamed of expanding someday. Willa shared stories of her childhood. Her father who had been kind but died too young. Her mother who had grown bitter with disappointment. "She wasn't always so hard," Willa said one evening. "When my father was alive," she smiled more. "After he died, it was like a light went out inside her." "Still no excuse for turning out her own daughter," Dane replied, his voice tight with an anger he rarely displayed. Willa looked down at Hope, asleep in her arms. "I keep wondering what I'll tell her when she's old enough to ask about her father." "Tell her the truth," Dane said simply. "That he wasn't man enough to stand by you, but that doesn't lessen her worth one bit." As summer bloomed across the Colorado plains, Willa began to realize that her feelings for Dane had grown into something deeper than gratitude. She found herself watching him as he worked around the cabin, admiring the strength in his hands and the kindness in his eyes. Sometimes she would catch him looking at her with an expression that made her heart beat faster, but he never stepped beyond the bounds of propriety. They were sitting on the porch one evening, Hope gurgling happily in Willa's lap, when Dane cleared his throat. "Been thinking," he said, his eyes on the distant mountains. "You and Hope have been here almost 3 months now." Willa's heart sank. Was he about to ask them to leave? She had known this arrangement couldn't last forever, but the thought of leaving the safety of Dane's cabin filled her with dread. "I know we've imposed on your hospitality far too long," she began. "No," Dane interrupted, turning to face her. "That's not what I meant. I was hoping, really, that you might consider staying permanently." Willa stared at him, uncertain. "As your housekeeper?" A flush crept up from Dane's collar. "As my wife, if you'd have me." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Willa could hear her own heartbeat, the soft cooing of Hope, the distant lowing of cattle. "Dane, You don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "I know it's sudden, and you've been through so much. But I want you to know that I've come to care for you, Willa, for both of you, and I'd be honored to call you my family." Hope chose that moment to reach out and grab a fistful of Dane's shirt, making a delighted sound when he smiled down at her. "She's already made her opinion known," Dane said, gently freeing his shirt from the baby's grip. Willa looked at this man who had saved them, who had built a cradle for a child not his own, who was now offering them a name and a home. There was no grand passion in his proposal, no flowery declarations of undying love. Just a simple, honest offer from a good man. "Yes," she said softly. "We'll stay." The smile that lit Dane's face was worth more than 1,000 poetic speeches. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "I'll make you both happy, Willa. That's my promise to you." 2 weeks later, they were married by the circuit preacher who came through the area once a month. The ceremony was simple, held in the cabin with only Doc Wilson and his wife as witnesses. Willa wore her one good dress, freshly washed and pressed, with wildflowers in her hair. Dane had a new shirt for the occasion, and Hope was dressed in a gown that Mrs. Wilson had kindly provided. "By the power vested in me," the preacher intoned, "I now pronounce you man and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Dane's kiss was gentle, almost tentative, but it sent a warmth through Willa that she had never experienced before, not even with James, whose passionate embraces had led to her downfall. This was different. This was the beginning of something true. That night, after Hope was settled in her cradle, Willa stood nervously by the bed she had shared with Dane these past months, though he had always slept on a pallet by the fire, maintaining her honor. Now, as his wife, everything was different. He came to her slowly, giving her time to grow accustomed to his presence in this new way. His hands, when they touched her, were gentle despite their strength. He whispered her name like a prayer, and when they finally came together as husband and wife, Willa discovered what it meant to truly be loved by a man who respected her. Afterward, as they lay together in the darkness, Dane's arm around her shoulders and her head on his chest, he spoke softly. "I know I'm not Hope's natural father, but I want you to know that in my heart, she's mine as surely as if she were my own blood." Willa raised herself on one elbow to look into his face. "You've been more of a father to her in 3 months than James would have been in a lifetime." Dane smiled, touching her cheek. "Then it's settled. From this day forward, she's Hope Reed, my daughter." As summer faded into autumn, life on the small ranch took on a rhythm that Willa found deeply satisfying. She tended a kitchen garden, preserved food for the winter, and cared for Hope, who grew stronger and more alert with each passing day. Dane worked from sunrise to sunset, always returning home with a smile for his wife and a gentle word for the baby, who lit up at the sound of his voice. Their nearest neighbors, the Caldwells, lived 5 miles away, but distance meant little on the frontier. Sarah Caldwell became a regular visitor, bringing her own children to play with Hope as she grew. "You're blessed, Willa," Sarah said one afternoon as they watched Dane teaching Hope to pet a gentle mare. The little girl, now 8 months old and sturdy despite her premature birth, squealed with delight as the horse nuzzled her tiny palm. Dane Reed was the most confirmed bachelor in these parts before you came along. Half the unmarried women in the county had set their caps for him, but he never gave any of them a second glance. Willa smiled, watching her husband's patient hands guiding Hope's. I never expected to find happiness again after what happened. When my mother cast me out, I thought my life was over. Sarah patted her hand. The good Lord works in mysterious ways. Sometimes what seems like the end is just the beginning of something better. It wasn't always easy. Winter brought blizzards that kept them housebound for days at a time. The small cabin could feel cramped, and sometimes Willa would find herself longing for the comforts of her mother's home, the larger rooms, the well-stocked pantry, the luxury of privacy. But then Dane would come in from checking the stock, his face red with cold, and Hope would crawl to him as fast as her little hands and knees could carry her. And Willa would remember that no material comfort could replace the love that filled their small home. Spring arrived with new calves, fresh grass, and a letter. The postmaster's son delivered it one bright April morning, having brought the mail from town as a favor. Willa stared at the envelope, recognizing her mother's precise handwriting with a mixture of hope and dread. You don't have to open it, Dane said, watching her face carefully. I do, Willa replied. Whatever she has to say, I need to hear it. The letter was brief and formal. Margaret Bennett had heard through acquaintances that her daughter was married and living respectably on a small ranch. She expressed satisfaction that Willa had found a proper situation and suggested that perhaps, if convenient, Willa might bring her husband and child to visit sometime in the future. No mention was made of the circumstances of Willa's departure. No apology offered for the harsh words spoken. But it was an opening, however small. Will you go? Dane asked after reading the letter. Willa looked at Hope, now pulling herself up on furniture and babbling a constant stream of nearly words. She's her grandmother, the only one Hope has, since your parents are gone and my father has passed. I think we should, if you're willing. Dane nodded slowly. Family is important. But Willa, I won't stand by if she says one unkind word to you or to Hope. The visit was set for the following month. As the day approached, Willa grew increasingly anxious. What if her mother rejected Hope? What if she treated Dane with the condescension she had shown to those she considered beneath her station? The morning of their visit dawned clear and warm. Dane hitched the wagon while Willa dressed Hope in her prettiest gown, a gift from Sarah Caldwell. The little girl's dark curls were tied with a ribbon, her chubby cheeks flushed with excitement at the prospect of an adventure. Cedar Creek hadn't changed in the year since Willa had left. The same buildings lined the main street, the same faces turned to watch as the wagon rolled by. But Willa had changed. She sat straighter beside her husband, met the curious stares with a calm gaze. She was no longer the frightened, shamed girl who had slunk away at dawn. She was Mrs. Daniel Reed, a woman with a husband who respected her and a child who was thriving under their care. Her mother's house looked smaller than she remembered. The white paint was peeling in places, the garden not as well tended as it had once been. Margaret Bennett opened the door before they could knock, her eyes immediately going to Hope in Willa's arms. So this is the child, she said, her voice carefully neutral. This is Hope, Willa replied. Your granddaughter. And this is my husband, Daniel Reed. Dane tipped his hat politely. Madam. Margaret hesitated, then stepped back. Please come in. I've prepared tea. The parlor was exactly as Willa remembered: the horsehair sofa, the daguerreotype of her father on the wall, the Bible prominently displayed on the side table. They sat in awkward silence until Hope, squirming to be free, broke the tension. Down, Mama, she demanded. reaching toward the floor. Willa set her daughter on the carpet, where she immediately began to explore, crawling toward a footstool with determination. "She's very active," Margaret observed. "She is," Dane replied, a note of pride in his voice. "Doc says she's advanced for her age, especially considering she came early." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, I had heard she was premature." The implication hung in the air that perhaps the timing of Hope's birth suggested she had been conceived after Willa's marriage, not before. Willa opened her mouth to correct this misconception, but Dane spoke first. "Hope came into this world fighting for every breath," he said, his voice calm but firm. "She's a survivor, just like her mother. We're blessed to have them both in our lives." Margaret's face softened almost imperceptibly. "She does seem a healthy child now." "Thanks to Dane," Willa said. "He delivered her when there was no one else to help, built her first cradle with his own hands, stayed up nights making sure she kept breathing." Hope chose that moment to pull herself up on Margaret's skirt, looking up with a wide, gummy smile. Almost involuntarily, Margaret reached down and touched the child's cheek. "She has your eyes," she said softly to Willa, "and your father's smile." The tea that followed was less strained. Margaret asked about their ranch, their plans for the future. Dane spoke of his hopes to expand their herd, perhaps add more land someday. Willa talked about her garden, the preserves she had put up for winter, the quilt she was making for Hope's bed. When it was time to leave, Margaret walked them to the door. She hesitated, then said, "Perhaps you might visit again, when it's convenient." It wasn't an apology, but it was a beginning. As they drove away, Willa leaned against Dane's shoulder, Hope sleeping in her lap. "Thank you," she said. He glanced down at her. "For what?" "For standing by us. For being the man you are." He smiled, wrapping one arm around her while keeping the other on the reins. "They're mine to stand by, my wife and daughter. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." That night, after Hope was asleep in her crib, a larger one that Dane had built to replace the cradle she had outgrown, Willa came to her husband with news of her own. "I think our family might be growing," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her stomach. "I'm not certain yet, but I'm late, and I feel the same way I did with Hope at the beginning." The joy that spread across Dane's face was answer enough, but he pulled her close and whispered, "Nothing would make me happier, Willa. Nothing in this world." In the years that followed, the Reed Ranch prospered. Dane's careful management and hard work paid off, allowing them to add acreage and increase their herd. Hope grew into a lively, intelligent child with her mother's dark hair and a spirit all her own. She was joined by a brother, Joseph, born healthy and strong a year after that conversation, and later by twin sisters, Emma and Elizabeth. Margaret Bennett eventually sold her house in town and moved to a small cottage Dane built on their property. Age and time had softened her, and while she never directly acknowledged the circumstances of Willa's departure, she became a loving grandmother to all the Reed children, with a special fondness for Hope. On Hope's 5th birthday, as the family gathered around the table for cake, a special treat Willa had prepared, the little girl asked a question that had been long anticipated. "Mama, why don't I look like Papa? Joseph and the twins have his eyes, but mine are dark like yours." A hush fell over the table. Willa looked at Dane, who nodded slightly. "Well, sweetheart," Willa began, choosing her words carefully, "before I met your papa, there was another man who promised to marry me. He was your natural father, but he left before you were born." Hope's brow furrowed. "Didn't he want me?" Dane leaned forward. "He never knew what a treasure he was missing, Hope, but I did. From the first moment I saw you, tiny as you were, I knew you were meant to be my daughter." "So you chose me?" Hope asked, her eyes wide. "I certainly did. And your mama too. Best choices I ever made." Hope considered this, then nodded with the seriousness only a 5-year-old could muster. "I'm glad you're my papa, not that other man." "Me too, little one," Dane said, his voice rough with emotion. "Me too." Later that night, as they lay in bed with moonlight streaming through the window of the larger house they had built to accommodate their growing family, Willa turned to her husband. "Did you ever imagine this is where we'd end up? That day at the stagecoach station?" Dane pulled her closer. "I knew the moment I saw you that my life was about to change. I just didn't know how much." "And do you ever regret it? Taking in a woman with another man's child, building a life around someone else's mistake?" Dane propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with the same intensity he had shown on their wedding day. "Willa Reed, not one day has passed that I haven't thanked God for bringing you and hope into my life. What others saw as a burden, I recognized as a blessing. That's not a mistake, that's providence." He kissed her then, with the familiarity of years together but also with a passion that had only deepened with time. Willa wound her arms around his neck, grateful for this man who had seen value in her when others saw only shame, who had built not just a cradle but a home and a life for a woman and child who weren't his own, but whom he had claimed with all the love in his generous heart. Outside, the Colorado wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Within the walls of the Reed home, all was peaceful for children sleeping soundly, an elderly grandmother resting in her cottage nearby, and a couple whose unlikely beginning had blossomed into a love story as vast and enduring as the western landscape itself. In the end, Willa reflected as she drifted towards sleep in her husband's arms, it wasn't blood that made a family. It was love, choice, and the daily decision to stand by one another through whatever life brought. Dane had taught her that, from the moment he'd lifted her onto his horse that fateful day, to this quiet night surrounded by the family they had built together. The next morning dawned bright and clear, promising another day of the life they had created, a life Willa could never have imagined in her darkest hour, when her mother's rejection had seemed like the end of everything. Instead, it had been just the beginning. Hope was the first child awake as usual. She bounded into their bedroom with the energy only a 5-year-old could possess at dawn, launching herself onto the bed. "Papa, you promised to show me how to ride Daisy today," she exclaimed, referring to the gentle mare Dane had been training specifically for her. Dane laughed, scooping her up. "So I did, little one, after breakfast and chores." Willa watched them together, this child not of his blood who nevertheless had his determination, his kindness, his way of looking at the world with wonder. In Hope's face, she could occasionally see traces of James, but those fleeting resemblances meant nothing compared to the deeper qualities she had inherited from the man who had raised her. As the years continued to pass, the Reed Ranch became known throughout the county as one of the most prosperous and welcoming homesteads. Travelers were never turned away, and more than once, Dane and Willa found themselves taking in those in need, a young widow and her son left destitute after her husband's death, an elderly man whose farm had failed, a young couple just starting out who needed work and guidance. "You have a habit of collecting strays," Margaret observed once, watching as Dane patiently taught a neighbor boy how to break a horse. "I prefer to think of it as recognizing value where others might not," Willa replied. "Dane taught me that." Hope grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's compassion and her father's steady strength. At 18, she fell in love with Thomas Caldwell, Sarah's youngest son, who had grown up alongside the Reed children and knew the full story of Hope's beginnings. "It doesn't matter to me who your natural father was," he told her when he asked for her hand. "You're Dane Reed's daughter in every way that counts, and that's recommendation enough for any man." On Hope's wedding day, Dane walked her down the aisle of the small church that had been built in Cedar Creek. His hair was silver now, his face more lined, but his eyes still held the same kindness they had shown to a desperate young woman at a stagecoach station 13 years before. "You're sure about this?" he asked Hope quietly as they waited for the music to begin. Hope squeezed his arm. "As sure as you were when you decided to build that cradle for me." Dane's eyes misted. "That was the easiest decision I ever made." "And this is mine," Hope replied. "Thomas is a good man, Papa. Like you." The ceremony was beautiful, the celebration afterward joyous. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around the dance floor set up in the churchyard, Willa found herself watching her husband across the crowd. He was dancing with their youngest daughter, Elizabeth, the child's feet placed on top of his boots as he guided her through the steps. "He's a remarkable man," Margaret said, coming to stand beside Willa. At 80, she was frail now, but her mind remained sharp. "Yes," Willa agreed. "He is." "I was wrong," Margaret said suddenly. "All those years ago. I was so concerned with what people would think that I forgot what was truly important, my own daughter's well-being." Willa turned to her mother in surprise. In all the years since their reconciliation, Margaret had never directly addressed what had happened. "Mother, you don't have to." "I do," Margaret interrupted. "I've wanted to say it for years, but pride got in the way. I'm sorry, Willa, for turning you away when you needed me most, for caring more about appearances than about you." Tears filled Willa's eyes. "Thank you, Mother. That means more than you know." Margaret nodded, her own eyes damp. "You found a good man, a better man than I gave you credit for being able to attract. He saw your worth when others, including me, saw only circumstances." Across the yard, Dane looked up and caught Willa's eye. He smiled, that same slow, genuine smile that had warmed her heart from the beginning. She smiled back, feeling the connection between them as strongly as ever. Later that night, as guests departed and the newlyweds left for their new home on a parcel of land Dane had given them as a wedding gift, Willa and Dane stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the last wagon disappear down the road. "Happy?" Dane asked, his arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," Willa replied. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day, when I asked why you were helping us?" Dane chuckled. "I believe I said any decent man would do the same. And I knew even then that wasn't true. What you did taking in a pregnant stranger, delivering her baby, giving us both a name and a home that went far beyond decency. That was love, before you even knew you loved us." Dane turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Maybe I did know from that first moment. Maybe that's why I couldn't ride past and leave you there. Something told me you were meant to be mine, both of you." The years had been kind to Willa. At 35, her beauty had matured, enhanced by the confidence and contentment that came from being truly loved. Dane, nearing 50 now, was still strong and vital, though his work-worn hands testified to the years of labor that had built their ranch. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" she said softly. "The best," he agreed. "And it's far from over. We have grandchildren to spoil now, more horses to train, more land to work, more people to help," Willa suggested with a smile. Dane laughed. "Your mother's right, we do have a habit of taking in strays. But I wouldn't have it any other way." As they stood there in the moonlight, Willa thought about the long journey from that terrible morning when she had been cast out of her mother's house. The path had been hard at times, but it had led her here to this man, this family, this life full of love and purpose. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "For what?" "For building that cradle, for calling us yours, for everything that came after." Dane kissed the top of her head, his arms strong around her. "Thank you for letting me," he replied simply. And in that moment, as they stood together under the vast Colorado sky, Willa knew that sometimes the harshest endings could lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Her mother's rejection had set her on a path to find a love deeper and truer than she could have imagined, a love born not of passion or convenience, but of choice and commitment. A love that had built not just a cradle, but a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. In the distance, a coyote called again, its lone voice soon joined by others in harmony. Like that wild chorus, their lives had found their complementary notes, separate melodies that, when combined, created something far more beautiful than either could have produced alone. Dane took her hand. "Come to bed, wife. Tomorrow's another day." And as they walked inside together, Willa knew that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it as they had faced everything else, side by side, their love a shelter stronger than any storm.